Okay, guys, we're going to look at the personal factors that influence people's ability to take part in sport and activity. This is for GCSE PE Edexcel syllabus, so paper 2. So when you get these exam questions, what we mean by personal factors, in the exam question will mention the word personal factors. What we're looking at is target groups, when we group people together, and what those people's barriers may be. Now, typically, these are the 5 that the exam board cover: disabilities, gender, age, socioeconomic, and ethnicity. And again, like I say, we have to cover the barriers to these people, as well as maybe some of how their groups might affect their ability to take part in sport. Now, when we look at the exam papers and the likelihood of questions, we're really going to be focusing on age, socioeconomic ability, socioeconomic background, and disabilities. So looking at disabilities in terms of the personal factors, we are looking at sort of the barriers that prevent, and most exam questions are focused on the main barriers. Now, when we're looking at barriers, we always want to look at these key terms: opportunity, provision, and esteem. Now, opportunity means things that are that people have available to them. Okay, so it's more of a personal thing. So opportunity could be down to things like how much money they have or how much free time they have. Provision is what's put on by outside people or outside organisations, or what's available to them to take part in. And then esteem is a personal, emotional side of it, their confidence and their feelings. So when we want to revise it, you won't necessarily be asked about opportunity, provision, and esteem, but it's good to try and think of, can I break it down into opportunity, provision, and esteem? So when we're looking at barriers to people with disabilities, they tend to have less access to clubs, less opportunity to be able to get to those clubs, because one, there are less clubs available to people with disabilities, in local areas, and that's why they have less access. And obviously their disabilities make it harder to get to those places. They have limited facilities. It takes certain types of facilities, and there aren't as many coaches. So that sort of comes down to provision. There aren't those things available to those people with disabilities, which makes it harder for them to find opponents, and it's difficult to travel to compete against their opponents. So that's sort of like the knock-on effect. Now, if we're looking at more personal side of it, their opportunity, typically the cost of disability sports is higher because of the equipment, the requirements of the equipment, for example, specialist wheelchairs and running blades and whatnot, to be able to take part in those sports. So that cost increases, which is a lack of that opportunity for people with disabilities. And then we can look at things that might affect their esteem. Well, firstly, there's a lack of role models and people in the media with disabilities. There are people in media, but not as many as mainstream. There tends to be a negative stereotypical attitude of people about people with disabilities and people who have disabilities, about their stereotypes of what they can and can't do, which has a knock-on effect, and that lowers motivation and it lowers confidence. So that's your esteem points. So these are all sort of the barriers, and their knock-on effect is it's harder to compete, harder to find opponents, and harder to travel. When we're talking about social economic background, we are talking about how much money essentially someone has. Okay, that's putting it in very basic terms. And we're talking about whether people have high income or low income, or high amount of money versus low income. So the questions tend to be broken down into comparing people between having high and low incomes. And we can look at the difference between expensive sports versus cheap sports. So obviously people with a low income will end up focusing on the cheap sports, and then people with a high income can often take part in more expensive sports. And it'd be useful to give an example for people in those situations. If we talk about membership fees, could come under that expense. People on low income have a limited access to those sports because of the membership fees, whereas people on high income can afford those membership fees. And if you think things like court and pitch hire or green fees, if you're talking about golf or whatever the costs of what you're paying for, the lower income can't afford them, whereas higher income have more disposable income and they can afford them. So golf is a great example. There's equipment costs that come into it, and if you think, right, people with a lower disposable income maybe might take up sports more like boxing with lower costs of equipment and athletics, whereas people from higher disposable incomes like skiing might will have the money to buy that equipment. So we do have these other aspects that you could link into it as well. So people from a lower income tend to have a lack of time, whereas people from a higher socioeconomic income tend to have more time. And then you can take part in sports that might link to that. So sports that are shorter, for example, like games of squash, have a shorter time span, whereas sports that last longer, an example is marathon. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that that's linked to socioeconomic backgrounds, but it's sort of the examples that the exam board would give you. And then finally, we talk about age. Please don't be drawn into the fact that you think that older people can't take part in sport because they're old and all the characteristics you might associate with getting old, about their physicalities and stuff. It's not about that. It's about the typical lifestyle factors that are linked to age. So we're not talking about old people, we're talking about adults versus young people if it's talking about age. Now, adults tend to have less time because of work, okay? However, so they can't take part in as many activities. However, they do have more money, so they can afford to take part in those activities. Now, you could talk about the fact and bring in elements of the fact that the older you get, the less flexible you are, the less strength you have, and there's more likely to have injuries. But and that could be one of your answers, but really do focus on the time and the money side of it. As you get even older, and if an exam question was talking about the even older aspects on that, you could focus on things like as you get into retirement, you do have more time, and the types of activities those older people in retirement might take part in that have a lot more time available to them, but their disposable income goes down, so they might not be able to afford certain activities. So they're the sort of things you could think about and bring into it every exam question. They do like to ask questions generally about young people, and then don't be drawn into sort of saying that young people have more time at school and things like that. Start thinking about things that you can't do which your parents can do. So start thinking about less access to events because you have to take public transport because you can't drive. Think about that you have less money, you have less disposable income because you don't work, so you can't take up part in certain sports, and you're limited to sort of what's in your locality. So rather than sort of just traditionally saying, oh, you're at school so you can't do things, that's not right. It's about what you have, or what adults have that you don't have, and what adults have and you do have. So, but you do have more time because you don't have as many commitments as an adult. So they're the sort of comparisons you might make. You could bring into elements like social media and technology could get in the way of taking part in sports, but let's stick to these simple areas here for this sort of this simple revision aspect. So that's just a real quick overview of personal factors. Hope this video helps, and the best of luck in your exams.